Good evening. We're in for a special treat. Dr. Mackubin Owens will talk to you tonight about civil-military relations. Matt is an expert on this subject, to say the least, and many other subjects. He has a long and distinguished resume. He is the author of several books, including a splendid monograph on Abraham Lincoln and executive authority in wartime. His book, Civil-Military Relations after 9/11, won the Andrew Goodpaster Prize of Excellence in Military History. That is not only published at a high level in the book world, but in the journal and public intellectual world. He has been the editor of Orbis, one of the finest foreign policy magazines over the past 50 years, Foreign Policy Research Institute. He was editor-in-chief of one of my favorite magazines from 1990-97, Strategic Review, which was also excellent. Matt is widely published in top journals and newspapers of the country, including a regular for the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, Jerusalem Post, Los Angeles Times. He is a veteran of Vietnam, a platoon commander, wounded twice, awarded the Silver Star, retired as a colonel in 1994, and sort of as the distilled essence of Matt's wisdom and character. He is also a fellow New England Patriots fan, which is a mark of excellence. Before we start also, I would like our regent to stand up, please. Mr. Cole, thank you, because you are what makes this program possible. It's through the generosity of the university and the foresight of the regents that we have this program at the University of Colorado Boulder that has already become a national flagship. Steve Hayward, our first scholar, is at Berkeley, and Steve has been asked by several universities to start programs like this based on what you've accomplished. So thank you. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks to Bob. We go back a long time, and we do share this affection for the New England Patriots. But, anyway, a couple of things. I'm a Marine with a PhD, which of course makes me very, very dangerous. A couple of other things. I'm sorry I'm losing my voice here. Yes, sir.
Could you turn on your mic, please?
The mic's not coming through the room, I'm sorry. It's just projecting from the front.
I'll stand here. Can you hear me now? Don't know yet. The folks doing the sound asked me earlier if I had any PowerPoint. It reminded me of a story several years ago, actually a true story. I was at a conference in Chapel Hill, and Jim Mattis was one of the speakers, and that's when he famously remarked that PowerPoint makes you stupid, so I try to avoid PowerPoint whenever I can. I'd just like to point out, actually, how small a world this is, that in my classmate from high school, Annie DeVere here, now, we went to 29 Palms High School, so you tell me what our daddies did, okay? Spray base, I'm sorry. So, anyway, I'm real tickled to be here. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great program. It's a great campus. The last time I was here was about 30 years ago. I'm going to talk to you tonight about civil-military relations in the era of Trump. Now, when he was running for president, he made some pretty incendiary comments about the leadership of the U.S. military. For instance, he said the generals under Barack Obama have not been successful. Under the leadership of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, the generals have been reduced to rubble, reduced to a point where it is embarrassing for our country. He went on to imply that as president, he would replace Obama's generals with generals and admirals who would not subordinate military effectiveness to political correctness. Now, of course, the fact is that generals that he's placed in power are all Obama generals. Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor, John Kelly as his Chief of Staff. So, what are we to say about civil-military relations now during Trump's presidency? The important thing to remember is that any problems in civil-military relations are not a new thing. You can go back to the Clinton administration. You can look at the little spat between the president and Colin Powell over U.S. involvement in the Balkans. You can look at the Iraq War, the revolt of the generals, Don Rumsfeld. You can look at Obama, of course, with the firing of Stanley McChrystal and of Jim Mattis. A lot of people don't realize was in fact fired. So this is not a new issue. Civil-military relations is not a new problem. Before I talk more specifically about civil-military relations under Trump, I just want to make some general points about civil-military relations itself. What does the term mean? I argue that basically it's the interaction among the armed forces of the state, the government of the state, and the other institutions within that government, within that society. You can look at this basically as a bargain. That's the argument I made in my book. By the way, I'm actually writing a complete history of American civil-military relations. And that basically is my structure. That civil-military relations in the United States constitutes a bargain, and there are three parties to the bargain. The first is the one that we sometimes forget, and that, of course, is the people themselves, the people of the United States. The second is the government policymakers, the civilian policymakers. And then finally, the uniformed military. Periodically, this bargain has to be renegotiated. You get changes in political situation. You get changes in the social conditions, or technology, or geopolitics. If you look back over American history, you can argue basically that there have been a number of renegotiations. The first one, of course, after World War II. Up to that time, the U.S. military had been a peripheral institution. But with World War II, it became a central one, and it has remained one ever since. During the Cold War, you had another renegotiation with the rise of nuclear weapons, and in many cases, military strategies were pushed to the side. You had another renegotiation at the end of the Cold War with a shift to regional conflicts, constabulary operations, and those sorts of things that we saw in the Balkans in the 1990s and so forth. And then, of course, one after 9/11, as a result of the protracted conflict, the long war against terrorism, and the like. The big question, I think, for us is, will we be another renegotiation? And if so, what will it look like? Now, you get this bargain, and then I say that bargain then focuses on 5 questions. The first one, of course, is who controls the military. That's the one that most people think about when they talk about civil military relations, but it actually goes beyond that. So, how do we control the military? One of the theoretical arguments made by Sam Huntington, who talked about what he called objective control. His argument was that you gave the military an autonomous space within which it could make its decisions. And as long as it remained loyal to the government, whoever was in charge of the government, then the military would be left alone in that space. He talked about a professional military corps. He said a highly professional officer corps stands ready to carry out the wishes of any civilian group which secures legitimate authority within the state. And what you get here, he says, if you simultaneously maximize military effectiveness and civil military control. But there are other questions, basically. What does that really mean when you say civilian control? Does civilian control simply mean the dominance of civilians within the executive branch? What about Congress? What about the legislative branch? Is there a unified military establishment? Do they speak as a monolith? What is the nature of military advice? That's, of course, one of the big responsibilities of the officer corps to provide advice to the civilian policymakers, but not to insist. That's a very important distinction to make. What options do they have when the civilians basically make decisions that the military thinks are going to be problematic for the country? And we developed something we call a calculus of dissent, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. The second issue in civil military relations is what is an acceptable level of military influence. Of course, at the extreme, you have militarism, where the military dominates all aspects of society. The classic example of that, of course, is Prussia, which was once described as an army with its own state. Of course, the fact is that Americans have a major tradition of anti-militarism. But the question then becomes, still, even with that, how influential should the military be in terms of politics? What did we mean by expertise? Huntington talked about the fact that the expertise of the military officer was the management of violence. Today, if you look at that, it goes far beyond that. Of course, military officers do lots of other things, and that leads to another issue. With the rise, basically, of the regional commanders, they're basically called unified commanders. Are we militarizing our foreign policy? People look at these unified commanders and refer to them as basically as proconsuls or viceroys. What about the issue of domestic politics? Should officers be writing op-eds, supporting programs or anything like this? Should they be involved in partisan politics and the like? What about the whole idea of what the military does? Should it be involved in domestic peacekeeping issues, constabulary operations, basically the taking care of natural disasters and those sorts of things? These are issues basically that have been answered at different times in a different way. For a very long time, the focus of the military was on constabulary operations within the United States. As a matter of fact, in 1804, the United States military was designated as the enforcer of domestic law. It's not really until you get to the period before the Second World War that you see the military begin to focus on external threats, and focus on warfighting against other state armies and the like. What pattern of civil-military relations best ensures military success? Is there, you need a culture, a military culture, that's distinct from the one that we have in civilian society? What about the way we make our decisions? How do we, what system is best for making sure that the military is used in the most effective and efficient way? And the final of these questions is, who serves? Is the military an obligation of citizenship or something else? How are members recruited and trained? Should the military focus on something like diversity, or should they focus primarily on military effectiveness? relations. We've answered that differently over our history for a very long time, of course. And we maintain a very small military establishment. As a matter of fact, that was one of the big debates at the beginning of the Republic, is the size and even the existence of a regular establishment. We focused and we had this idea about a militia, but of course the militia idea pretty much went out the window with the War of 1812. After that, it was the responsibility of the states to raise troops, as they did in the Mexican War and the Civil War. And then we went into conscription, which we held until the 1970s. And today's force, of course, is primarily a volunteer force. But there's still other questions that come up. What about the role, basically, of the reserve? What about the role, basically, of women in the infantry? What about the enrollment, basically, of open homosexuals? These sorts of issues that have been decided are under renegotiation now. These, of course, are all parts of these things we'll be talking about. Okay, with those 5 questions, there's several points that I want to put use for historical context for what the issues we have are today. The first thing is civil-military relations and tensions are not a new phenomenon. Anybody who's looked at this kind of goes back to the 1990s and they see that dispute between Clinton and Powell, and they say this is what started it all. The fact is, you can go back to the foundations of the Republic. You can look at the whole idea of how Washington basically nipped in the bud a mutiny on part of his officers in Newport. You can look at the whole idea of the debate between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians over a military establishment. Even something like Thomas Jefferson's establishment of a military academy at West Point had a political purpose. It was basically to get rid of all those Federalists and replace them with good Republicans and unhated Republicans. And that was essentially the purpose of establishing the military academy during this period of time. You had the Mexican War, where you had both generals were Whigs. The president was a Democrat. And those 2 Whig generals had presidential aspirations, Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. And they did not hesitate to criticize the president's strategy and so forth during the war. There were tremendous tensions, as you can imagine. The whole idea, basically, of the Civil War, I think it was the clash between McClellan and Lincoln. That was not so much as the story would normally have it, that McClellan just didn't want to fight because he wanted to protect his army. He just didn't want to fight the war that Abraham Lincoln wanted him to fight. And so these issues worked themselves out over a period of time, but there was tremendous tension over how the war was actually going to be conducted. During the Reconstruction, you had people who recommended to Andrew Johnson that he use the army against Congress to basically shore up his own position. You have a situation basically in the 1920s, the preparedness movement, which involved a great deal of participation by retired military folks into the civilian community, basically in an attempt to prepare the United States for the possibility of war. And then even the election of 1920, you had Leonard Wood, who was still on active duty, who campaigned for the Republican nomination in uniform. So as you can see, these issues are not new. The second point is that the absence of a coup does not necessarily mean that civil-military relations are healthy. That's been one of the big issues, I think, with military officers generally say, well, there's no danger of a coup like there are in Africa or South America, things like this. So we really don't have to worry about civil-military relations. But the fact is that balance, the whole idea of civilian control, the whole idea of disagreements and so forth, civil-military relations can become very unhealthy. I think in many respects they were unhealthy during the Clinton years. They were unhealthy during the Bush years. They were unhealthy during the Obama years. The fact is that if you're going to, you just have to understand that just because you don't have a coup doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going the way it should. The next thing, which is that civilian control means more than simply control of the front. I taught at the Naval War College. One of the things, the officers and students there were senior officers. We had both the intermediate and the senior guys. Officers, 12 years of commissioned service, another group of 18 years of commissioned service. And in many cases, they acted like Congress were a bunch of pests. And we had to convince them, of course, that that's not the case. If you're going to get money for your programs and so forth, you have to be able to convince Congress. And so Congress has a very important role in civil-military relations. Do they advocate it frequently? Yes, they have. And we have to be able to call them on that. But part of the idea is sometimes you get arguments that say, well, if you have a disagreement with the president and you go to Congress, that's an end run. But it's not. As a matter of fact, you're required basically all officers, when their ranks are approved by especially flag officer, the ranks are approved by the Senate. One of the things they agree to is to make to provide their advice and give their comments to Congress as well as to the president. So it's more complicated than just the Secretary of Defense and the like. Another point is that the military is not always right, even about military affairs. I'll just give you 3 instances. During the Civil War, Lincoln tended to be more correct on his assessment of the situation than McClellan. In the World War II, George Marshall, great officer that he was wrong on several occasions when you compare him to Roosevelt. Vietnam, you had the war was conducted in a particular way. We like to blame it on the civilians. The fact was there was an approach to war that was probably counterproductive, and that was directed by the military itself. So that's another point we have to remember is the fact that the military is not necessarily right all the time, even when it comes to military affairs. The 5th point is that dissent is not disobedience. As a matter of fact, you have to ensure the give and take. That's part of the deal. That it's simply not a matter of the military giving its advice and then shutting up. That advice has to go back and forth. And there has to be sufficient trust on both sides, on the trust on the part of the civilians to listen to the military folks, and on the part of the military to believe or accept the idea that even if the civilians are going to reject their advice, they have to understand that they're going to listen to it at least. There's going to be give and take. I think for the most part that's a very important point that we sometimes forget. Now the question is, what do you do if you don't get your way? Now, for a long time back in the 90s and well into the aughts, you had this view, and of course it was coming that the military should insist on their point of view. If the civilians don't listen, you insist. Well, that's not right. That's not the understanding of civil-military relations in the United States. If you don't get your way, then you resign. That's sort of a reading of H.R. McMaster's book, Dereliction of Duty, where he talked about decision-making during the Vietnam War. He never said any such thing. The fact is that we don't have a tradition of resigning over principle. As long as the order is and the decision is lawful, the military has an obligation to carry it out. But that's not simply to say that you can't argue, you can't push your points. It's a fine line between insistence and basically trying to argue to convince the other side. Six is, this is very important, when we talk about disputes between civil-military relations, it's not usually between the civilians per se and the military per se. It's usually going to be between coalitions. Groups of civilians and military folks working together against other groups or other coalitions. Some of the best examples basically are the debate over air power at the end of World War II. You had the advocates of an emerging Air Force who were pushing their case against the Navy. The Navy was pushing its case against the Air Force. And it was not simply the military versus the civilians. It was a coalition of people in the government, people in the press, people in the Congress, and so forth, pushing their views. Even the most celebrated example of civil-military crisis was Truman's firing of MacArthur. Again, you had a coalition. You had Truman and two Army guys, you had Eisenhower and Marshall, who both argued that he should be fired. MacArthur's support came from mostly Republicans in the Congress. You have other instances. One of the big problems, I think, is as we move forward and when budgets become tight, those are going to be the sorts of things that we're going to see more and more of. 7th point has to do with patterns of civil-military relations. I don't want to get into that. It's a little on the technical side, but the thing is that how we make decisions, the decision-making process, the way we set up to do these sorts of things, has very important impact on the outcome. The final point I'd like to make is the difference between being political and being partisan. You hear all the time the military shouldn't be political, but it has to be in the sense they have to understand the process, they have to understand the way decisions are made, they have to understand organizational issues and so forth. And again, I spent 28 years up in Newport talking to officers about how to operate within the bureaucracy of the what I call the Emerald City. Basically how to understand the way things work. That is different from partisanship. Partisanship is the issue of you associate yourself with one party or another. Unfortunately, there's more of that, and I think that's something we need to nip in the bud. I think that's going to be a little bit on the destructive side. So, let me stop that with the whole issue of sort of the background, and now I'll turn specifically to the issues that arise with Trump, President Trump. First claim is there are too many generals. Too many generals in his array of national security advisors. Already named who those are. And that they have too much influence. That he's delegated too much authority to the military. And finally, that he has basically backed off some of the issues, some of the social changes that were made within the military regarding, again, things like transgender and so forth. And so, let me deal with those individually. The first, of course, is that what about the idea of generals serving as Secretary of Defense and the like? It turns out that a year ago today, I had the opportunity to testify in the committee, House Armed Services Committee, on the waiver that had to be granted to Jim Mattis to become Secretary of Defense. And basically my argument was that you don't want to abandon the requirement that an officer or a general be out, or general or admiral be out of active service for 7 years before they can serve as Secretary of Defense. I said, however, there are certain cases where you make exceptions. And I said, you made an exception in 1950 with George Marshall, and I think you should make the same exception with somebody like Jim Mattis, who is a poster boy for good, healthy civil military relations. If you look at his time as a commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East, as CENTCOM, you don't see the sorts of things that have been associated with unhealthy civil military relations. So that was my argument, simply that you don't want to you don't want to lose the service of somebody like this. So you make the way where you don't abandon the rule, but you make an exception as necessary in this. Now, there's a more troubling idea on the other side, which I don't know, what's his name? Morning Joe Scarborough. He said not too long ago that there needed to be a cabinet coup against the president. Well, he's an idiot, so I don't really care what he says, but I do care when somebody like Rosa Brooks, who teaches law at Georgetown University, and wrote a very good book on the military, said this. She wrote right after the election, she said that Trump's first week in president has made it all too clear that he is as crazy as everyone feared. One possibility is one that until recently I would have said was unthinkable in the United States of America. A military coup, or at least a refusal by military leaders to obey certain orders. Now think about this. I mean, this is a well-educated woman who understands the American system. She's liberal, and in the old days she would have actually been horrified at that idea. But yet here you go with somebody who's essentially arguing that you need these generals to surround the president to keep him from doing really dumb things. Okay, well, I mean, the fact is that, my argument and with people like H.R. McMaster and Jim Mattis is that when it comes to President Trump's foreign policy, they're nudging him in the right direction. And again, it's not a military coup. It's not any sort of idea bait. When you have military officers who surround the president, that's called Praetorianism. And we traditionally don't like Praetorianism. The Praetorian Guard, basically, their original job was to defend the emperor. But eventually, they began to choose who the emperor was going to be. And when we look at countries, when you look at Turkey, or you look at Egypt, or France during the period of time after their defeats in Indochina and Algeria, you see this Praetorianism arising. That is unhealthy. We don't want that sort of thing. So the idea somehow that it has become possible in polite company to suggest that the president's beyond the pale and that we ought to count on these generals to protect us from him, I think is a very dangerous idea. What about this idea of, just another thing on this, is that one of the things you see with the press sometimes is they like to say, okay, here's the president, and here's, say, Jim Mattis. And the president says something, and Jim Mattis says this, they disagree. And they see light between their arguments. Mattis basically said this at one point, he says, if I say 6, and the president says half a dozen, they're going to say I disagree with them. And let's just get it. I think that's a very important point. There are other things. You may have seen this thing not too long ago where Hayden, who was the commander of STRATCOM, Strategic Command, was interviewed, and we said, Thomas, they asked him a specific question. If the president gives you an illegal order to launch a nuclear strike, what are you going to do? And he said, well, probably not going to do it. And everybody said, terrific. But, my remark was that I hope we would reject any illegal order. And that's exactly the point. We have a process, all these sorts of things. We have ways of doing these sorts of things, and we this idea somehow that the generals have to protect us from Trump, I think is problematic. The issue basically of delegating authority. one of the things you saw with the Obama administration was very much centralization in the White House. During his period of time, at one point, he had a very weak Secretary of Defense, and he was when a lot of these decisions were being made by people like Ben Rhodes in the White House and so forth. And with a couple of problems, when they had a few issues, they basically then put a competent guy back in there, Ash Carter, who was very good in this sort of thing. But still, the idea within the Obama administration was very much centralization of military and foreign policy decisions. I think you've seen a healthy delegation of that. That's not to say you just let the generals do what they want. That's not that at all. But the idea that there has to be a certain amount of discretion on the part of military commanders on the ground where they are to be able to make those sorts of decisions. One of the biggest issues that affected the military, the performance of the military in places like, especially more recently in Afghanistan, have been very restrictive rules of engagement. Now, we, the United States, by the way, they took back to Vietnam, people don't realize that we have always followed probably more restrictive rules of engagement than our enemies do. Certainly, we had more restriction on us than the North Vietnamese did on them. The point is that at some point, you have to recognize the necessity for flexibility. Because people on the ground, people at the decision-making point, have more understanding of the circumstances. And so I think in general, this idea of delegating more authority to commanders is a good thing. Let me see. I think that, let me close here and move to the questions. Let me say a couple of things that, as we look at the future of civil-military relations, whether we're talking about President Trump or not, there are some factors I think we're going to have to keep in mind. One is basically that we're at a period of time where money is going to be tight. And for a very long time, what we call jointness, that is the ability of all the services to work together, was not only things like the Goldwater Nichols Act and so forth. It was the fact that for the most part, all the services were getting all the money they wanted, for the most part. That's probably going to go away. So you're going to see more competition. You're going to see more of a discussion of these sorts of things that's going to create some real problems. You also have the emergence of new technologies and so forth. Oversight of special operations forces, cyber. These are new undertakings of war that will probably require different approaches to civil-military relations. The participation gap. We all know about the other 1%. We talk about 1% or fewer than 1% of the American people serve in the military. That's at historic lows. The problem, of course, is that that's going to create some real issues as we move into the future. So, I would conclude by saying that basically we live at a time where the civil-military tensions, which I say is not a new phenomenon, but it takes a different form than it has in recent times. And we're just going to have to recognize that. So here are the questions that civilian leaders have to ask themselves. How informed are they when they choose to go in the military? How well does the prevailing pattern of civil-military relations enable the integration of divergence and even contradictory views? The fact is you're going to have contradictory views on just about everything. Look, we develop plans for just about every contingency that you can imagine. You don't think there's plans for dealing with North Korea doesn't vote. None of them are very good, but the fact is their plans are out there. And that's true of just about every place on that. Probably the most important question is going to be that of trust. The big problem you can point back all the way to the Clinton issue is the lack of trust between the political folks and the military folks over the issue of advice, the issue of how do you make decisions, what are we going to do, how are we going to do it. And the thing is that you must have this recognition of an exchange of candid views and perspective among the two parties in the decision-making process. To establish this trust, you have to have both parties re-examine their mutual relationship. On the one hand, the military must recover its voice in strategy making, which has been given up to a certain extent, while realizing that politics permeates everything. This idea of having strategy without any consideration of politics is nonsense. It's always going to be part of the consideration. Politics permeates the conduct of war, and civilians have the final say. That's the system that we have. Not only concerning the goals of any conflict, but also how it is conducted. On the other hand, civilians must understand that to implement effective policy and strategy requires the proper military instrument, and therefore they must insist that the soldiers give them their views as frankly as possible and forcefully, not just frankly, but forcefully. Throughout the strategic strategy making process, this idea somehow that the civilians say, okay, go to war, and the military says, okay, get out of the way, we're going to take care of that. That's simply wrong. That's not the way strategy works. It's not the way war works. Wars are not fought for their own purpose. Wars are fought for political purposes. And therefore, the political aspect of it has to be constantly integrated as we whether we're talking about Afghanistan, or we're talking about Iraq, or we're talking about North Korea, or any of these sorts of things. What we want to do is, I always say that there are three words that you need to understand, three concepts you need to understand when you're talking about healthy civil-military relations. The first one is trust, the second one is trust, and the third one is trust. So, thank you very much. I apologize for my voice, but yes, sir.
What impact on decision making does the military-industrial complex have? That wasn't really addressed.
Yeah, that's good point, good question. A lot of people, if you look at, there's a lot of it. The fact is, the folks in that industrial base are kind of pushing their ideas. And I know, there are a lot of people who think that they have too much influence in decision making. The problem in many cases is that the military decision-making process is too slow and cumbersome. And that in many cases, what you have these folks who are going to provide you with opportunities. Now, that's just something that has to be worked out. You get people like Ralph Peters, Ralph hates, he hates contractors. He makes it very clear any time he talks about it. But our system, with all of its flaws, is far superior than the alternatives. One completely run by the government or something else. The problem, of course, is that when you have a fundamentally free economy, and ours is fundamentally free, you have different sets of incentives that people are responsible. And we just have to realize that and take care of it. I know that Jim Madison basically said to his deputy, he wants somebody with a procurement background. That is his focus. The procurement background, somebody knows how to buy weapons and the like. We do well sometimes, we do poorly sometimes, but it is you're right, it is an issue that's part of the debate over civil military relations.
In how many countries do we have military advisory committees?
Oh, lots. And as a matter of fact, I mean, there's an argument. You get, I suggest that that's the best way for us to leverage our military forces, rather than doing what we've done in, say, Iraq or even Afghanistan, with large numbers of troops on the ground, is basically to use what's called foreign internal defense, to basically advisory teams and so forth to shore them up. That's a relatively cost-effective way of doing things. But it also leads to, like the fellow who was killed in Nigeria?
Nigeria.
Not too long ago. He was part of one of those teams. And immediately you had the question, well, what's he doing there? Well, we have troops in Nigeria for. Well, part of the answer is you've got Boko Haram, and it's a big issue. So rather than inserting large numbers of American troops, the idea is we have advisory teams. Now, the problem with advisory teams, is the case in Vietnam, is sometimes they can suck you in to the big war. But the starting point should be that this is a really cost-effective way of doing business, and that we should probably focus more on that than we have in the past. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what's the role of a U.S. representative, particularly one without a committee assignment, in bridging the gap between civilians and the military? That's for Jared Bolus, for example. I'm doing an internship right now and focusing on a project on that.
Yeah.
And he's not on a committee or anything. What role does he have in helping bridge that civilian-military gap?
Well,
If any at all?
well, the way it's set up, I mean, with all the committee systems, the fact is that the members of Congress and senators on way too many committees. They don't have time to do what they do. You'll do most of the work on these sorts of things. Even somebody on the Armed Services Committee, that's only one of the things they do. It's going to be those, there's basically a delegation of authority. The members of, say, the Armed Services Committee and the Defense Appropriations Committees and so forth. So probably less than you might expect, except on the big votes and the thing when it comes to the floor. But I think that, that's been the practice for a long time, that congressmen and senators are required to do so many things on so many different committees that they basically specialize. When I worked in the Senate, I worked for a senator who was on some 5 committees. He was on the Budget Committee, he was on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, he was on Foreign Operations, which handles foreign aid. And it was really hard to do all those sort of things, but people deferred to him as he would defer to the others on what they had their expertise in. Sure.
So does the fact that the percentage of our elected representatives having military experience has dropped, is dropping, continues to drop, do you think that has any bearing on the future of civil-military relationships?
Yeah, that goes back to the 1%. It's not just the 1% that's in the service. The fact is that when I worked in the Senate in the 1980s, you could say that maybe 45 to 50% had some degree of military experience. It's under 10%. Now, you're getting a little bit of a surge, from folks coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, people going into Congress, so that might build that up a little bit. But I know that my friend Peter Feeder down at Duke and a couple of his friends have actually looked at the makeup of congressional committees and so forth, or during votes, and has looked at it in terms of the military experience. Those with military experience tend to be less enamored of the idea of intervention. So, that's one point. Yes, sir.
I was trying to square what you said about money becoming scarce for the military, and the fact that in the current budget plans, Congress is trying to give them a lot more money than they requested.
Well, that's true. I think part of that has to do with We may not believe it, but there's such a thing as way too much money where you have to make, it's harder to make decisions on those searches. I know that Secretary Mattis has asked for a certain amount of money, just because I think they want to rationalize things. It's also the case that you have to look at the whole fiscal health of the United States. The defense budget is a very small part of federal spending. It's if you look at compared to basically social programs like Medicare, Social Security, and so forth, it's dwarfed by those sorts of things. Whenever you spend $1 in the federal government, you have operating costs. So I think that you always, by the way, you always have this little battle between the folks who want more spending on defense all the times in Congress, and then the folks who call them fiscal hawks, whatever you want, who want to say, look, let's get our house in order before we actually try to increase these, the spending of this particular area.
Well, I guess, my question was, why do you say that the money is going to be scarce when they're already, Congress is trying to give them more than they've requested?
I don't know. I think that'll change. I think the part of the problem is that there's so many, that there's a lot of competition among the services in terms of providing particular outputs. And that's going to be the problem, I think, in the future. I mean, even the F-35 or the new combatants in the Navy, the Army is basically looking at an entirely new system of future combat. It used to be called Future Combat System. It's got some new name now. But what I meant in that was that there was a long period of time where, the military back from the 80s on, even with some of the dips, pretty much got what they want. Not everything, but I think it's done. Even if the Congress wants to give them more, there's not just more to give. And I think you're going to see some drop off, and you're going to see more competition, I think, among the services, which can get very nasty. I mean, you're going to see, difficult times go back to 1947, 1948. You see the debates over unification, the bloody fights between the Air Force and the Navy, especially. We don't want to go back to that, but that might be the issue if you don't have money, even if Congress is trying to give them more, because Congress isn't always going to get its way. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned this 1% thing. I'd like to come back to that. When we had an enlisted army, the non-officer corps was a fairly uniform representation of our country, of the people in our country. Now, the non-officer corps is primarily Southern, they're primarily rural, their economic status and so on is quite different from, and education status is quite different from the general public if you take averages.
Yeah.
Is there a way to address that?
Well, that's a good question. There's actually, before he went back into become Secretary of Defense, Jim Addison and Corey Shockey edited this book at Stanford Hoover Institute called Citizens and Warriors. And that was one of the issues they addressed. It's exactly that problem. The South, South Boston, have traditionally sent more people into the military than others. I don't know. I mean, as long as you have a volunteer force, that's what you're going to get. The other thing, which is interesting to me, is that an extraordinarily high number of folks, both officer and enlisted, are juniors. That is, they're brats. They're military brats. They grew up in a military family. And, so you get this possibility of what, sort of hereditary military service. But you're not going to be able to really address that, I think, until you, as long as we continue to have a volunteer And by the way, I support the idea of a volunteer force. I think the idea of having any kind of a conscription military draft is kind of it's misplaced. I think that you don't need that. You don't need a military like it. You need military folks who come who want to do the job and have the specialties and the education and the desire to do the job. But that's a problem. Sort of the whole idea of geographic diversity. Yes, sir.
To what extent do you think new military technologies are going to affect how wars are fought in the future? And also, kind of relatedly, have you seen any significant changes in how wars have been fought because of new technologies since, say, like Vietnam or around that time period?
I mean, that's a big question. It talks about this renegotiation of the bargain. Okay, what does everybody talk about these days? Well, cyber. Do you need a SEAL, Navy SEAL, to operate that? Do you need somebody who can do 5,000 push-ups and do all the sort of physical things and core skills and special forces, infantry in general to do? Well, maybe not. The military. This is interesting. The military promotion and system. Now we do it for doctors, nurses, lawyers, and so forth. We have direct commissions where people come in and they because they have this expertise, they want and so forth. So should we do the same sort of thing for hackers and the like? I mean, the fact is, I'm sure we get some of these guys someplace, but you want some fat guy with a beard, as a major in the army or something like that. Well, that doesn't mean standard, of course, for before. But it needs to be something we have to consider in the future. It's going to change possibility. Can we imagine sometime in the future where you don't need kind of infantry folks on the ground that we have today? I don't know. I mean, science fiction, yes. But so far, we still need folks like that. We still need special forces guys. We still need infantry guys. We still need those folks. The other big issue, of course, is unmanned aircraft or vehicles in general. The pilot out there, what's going to be able to do? The officers love, talk to about the, manned aircraft. That was the bread and butter, both naval aviation and the Air Force. Okay, now all of a sudden you've got some guy at Nellis Air Force Base outside of Las Vegas flying missions in Afghanistan. And that sort of changes the dynamics in a lot of different ways. By the way, one of the, in Orbis, I'm still the editor of Orbis. Several years ago, I published a piece by, actually she's a colleague now in the War College named Lindsay Cohn on this whole issue of sort of the change in the way wars are fought and how that will affect so many aspects. The old idea of the warrior coming home, kind of basically working out of combat, and now you're sitting in an air-conditioned place outside of Las Vegas, and you're going to go home to your wife and kids. So that's a different dynamic. Good question. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a question about something that's got me genuinely scared. If Trump decides in some fit of pique that it's time to bomb North Korea, the nuclear strike, is the military obligated to follow his whim?
No, not his whim. We have a process for that. Look, I mean, I hate Twitter. You say that. I think Twitter, I describe Twitter as a way of showing how stupid you can be in 140 characters. I guess it's going to be too late. You do it. All right. So, and we know that the president loves his Twitter. He's not going to launch an attack with Twitter. I mean, the fact is, it's a very formal process involved in the whole sort of thing. So, I mean, I wouldn't worry about that. I would worry more about the possibility of an enemy taking, launching some sort of strike. Anyway, I wouldn't worry about that. Although, Rosa Brooks.
Is the military obligated?
They're obligated to execute lawful orders. As long as the lawful order within the way the process has been laid out in regulations and in the like, then you're not gonna have somebody just launch a strike, something like the news used to get during the Cold War, or some rogue general. Well, let's bring Dr. Strangelove. We're not gonna have that. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think unmanned vehicles and aircraft will lead to a lack of accountability for military strikes?
Say that again.
Will unmanned vehicles and aircraft lead to a lack of accountability for military strikes?
So far, they're still controlled by human beings who are obligated by regulation and law to do certain things. So, you always have sort of this, what do you call it, the idea of science fiction that everything is turned over to robots. But as long as you have the civilian element, then you still have the accountability.
Well, prior to each strike, you also have to collect 3D estimations about how much this particular weapon can perform, what is the explosive impact of such and such, or if you drop that weapon. The answer in short is probably no.
Yes, ma'am.
So in class we're learning about the virtue of political will when it comes to winning a war. And I'm wondering, when it comes to the more new age technological warfare, I'm just wondering how that changes how enemies will assess political will when when there's less accountability and things like that, with more like channels through the cyber warfare and whatnot.
That doesn't change the accountability. I mean, but you raised a very good question. I mean, assessing will is always a problem. When we go back to Vietnam, there's an old story, perhaps apocryphal, that Harry Summers told. That when the Nixon administration came in office in 1969, they of course were dealing with the Vietnam War, and they fed all the information into a big Cray computer, something like this, and pushed the button and said, "When will we win?" And the computer says, "You won in 1964." The point of that, of course, is that the material factors are, in many cases, less important. The problem we had in Vietnam was what Clausewitz calls the value of the objective was greater for the Vietnamese than it was for us. So that's always a problem. I don't think it's going to change as a result of technology or anything like that. It's something that we always have to assess. What's the cost of it? And it gets back to my point earlier, which is you don't say, okay, man, here, launch the war, and we'll just get out of the way. The fact is, as you go along, you have to basically revisit, you have to evaluate, and you have to, examine the various iterations of your decision down the road. Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask a sci-fi question.
Uh-oh.
All right. So the world has become a lot smaller these days. You can literally get from here to Europe in a few hours. It used to be that way. The moon is 250,000 miles away. We have a base on the moon, which we're probably going to meet in the next 2 decades. It's not going to be a small world anymore for people who are there. How does that affect civil-military relations?
Probably makes it more important to have healthy ones. Look, I mean, there was a time where, people, I guess my other area of study is geopolitics. I'm kind of a defender of classical geopolitics. And back in the 90s, you had people say, well, technology renders geography unimportant. Well, they missed the point. There's Bob Kaplan in his book, really bring you back an classical understanding of geopolitics. I'm reviewing his next book, and he talks about it. He says the fact is that what technology has done is exactly what you said. It hasn't eliminated it has just made the world small. And what that basically means the decision cycles and so forth are going to be reduced. I mean, you can just think, you take, in 1805, the Battle of Ulm or the Campaign of Ulm and so forth, you have the relationship between space and time. You have not that large an area, but the time was spread out over. You move up 100 years, and then the space expands and the time goes down. By the time you get to the modern battlefield, the loop is amazing. You have to account for forces on a very large battlefield, but you have to make those decisions much more quickly. Now, you can help yourself with technology, but again, we come back to that critical point. How much authority do you want to delegate to a robot or something like that? And I think most of us say we want to be careful about that. Yes, sir.
This is maybe just a historical question. You said that Bill Clinton had bad relations with the military, and I remember reading some time back that because Bill Clinton maybe thought he was perceived as a draft dodger or whatever, had given the military kind of wide swath of power to kind of do what they wanted to do. I wanted to know if that was true, and if it was true, if that was maybe the reason that he had bad relations, that they maybe didn't respect him because he didn't get involved enough. I just wonder what was going on with that dynamic, that it was flawed, or that it was maybe broken.
Yeah, I think that, the fact is that he had some real difficulty at the beginning. But I think the fact is that over time, he recognized that and he made some, serious outreaches and the like. And I think that by the time he get to the end of his presidency, things were a lot better. For one thing, he concluded that the military was the only part of the government that would actually do what he told them to do. So there really is a lot to that. But certainly early on, there was real, hostility between presidents and the military. Now, to his credit, I think President Obama tried to fix that early. One of the first things he did, the staff, not necessarily a good decision, but appointing Jim Jones, retired Marine general, as the National Security Advisor, bringing on General Shinseki at the VA and things like this, to surround himself with people who had military gravitas. So now things don't really work out. But I think it's interesting in many respects that I always say that it's much easier to be president when you're not. So when you're running for president, you can say all sorts of things. But when you sit down and you look around and you get the briefings and so forth, now it becomes much more difficult. I think you see that for everybody. Every president comes in with what he or she is going to do. And then they look around and say, well, maybe I can't do all of this. And by the way, I think that applies to President Trump. I think, he had certain views. He seems to be fairly flexible. And the fact is as I understand it, knowing some of these folks, that he listens. And that he is, he's not a loose cannon to the extent that some people think. The fact is that he may be flexible to a fault. Sometimes that's called having no real center in terms of what you want to do. But the evidence so far indicates that he does listen to his advice. He may not necessarily agree with them, but he agrees more and more. I don't want to play inside baseball. The fact is that I know for a fact that he is being influenced by people who are his advisors. He's still making the decisions, but I think the decisions they've been nudged in a certain direction. Yeah, we get there.
If it is true or not whether 60% of taxes go into defense. And now you're saying the federal budget for military is pretty low.
60% doesn't go into the.
Okay, I don't know how I kept getting those kind of figures.
Yeah, no, I'll look the, let's say the percentage of the defense, the defense, percentage of the federal budget goes to defense is less than 20%.
It's less than what?
20%.
14%.
Yeah.
I don't
And so
know
most
how
of
those
the money that is spent by the federal government is spent for social work. They're, it's called non-discretionary spending. It's basically, what that means basically is that once you meet the requirements set up by the law, say Social Security or Medicare or something like that, you are entitled to Congress can change that if they want, but they don't. You know, the old story that Social Security was the third rail of politics. Now even when you look at GDP, defense spending is less than 5%.
Okay, I don't know where I got the information. It sounds like fake news, but so what about our anti-ballistic missiles that we supposedly have, or do we, to offset nuclear strikes against us? Or is that also fake news?
No, look, I mean, there's, you go back to the Reagan years and the whole idea of strategic defense and so forth. The fact is that, we have, fundamentally theater, I forget what they're basically factory and so forth that can intercept that.
Terminal high area.
And we have them mounted not only on land, but also on ships and so forth. So, now as far as, we don't really have anything in terms of strategic defense. I mean, we had the situation, we deployed systems in Europe, and of course that upset the Russians because they thought it was and we argued it was aimed at the Iranians. But yeah, I mean, ballistic missile threat is something that, for a long time we depended on deterrence. We depended on the idea that, okay, you can hit us, but yeah, we can hit you, and let's decide, let's agree we're not going to shoot at each other. But the problem is that that's not necessarily a stable system. So the idea was that you have to, a little bit of insurance. And that's there are a lot of people that I know think we don't spend enough money on defense, missile defense. You have single issue folks in defense just like you have every place else. Now that's all we care about is missile defense. Next.
Yeah, in the course of your remarks, you mentioned that the last three previous administrations, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration, all suffered from unhealthy civil-military relations. Do you see any indications in the Trump administration that he's taking any action to restore a more healthy civil-military relations?
Well, as I say, he seems to be listening. Now, again, that's his critics would say he listens too much. But when he put the question over there about some madman launching a strike and so forth, he seems to, and maybe defers too much, but he clearly respects the matters, and is giving good advice and nudging him with the things where they disagree, and so far I would say it's I won't say it's perfect, but I think it's in respect of everything was under Obama, which might seem counterintuitive, especially given his claims during the campaign where he basically insulted the council. But the fact is, it seems to me that he is doing a much better job of at least listening to the council. Oh, you think their advice is good, then you're doing good.
3 more questions before we do that. I also want to give an advertisement. Matt is also the Dean of the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. That program gives a certificate.
That's propaganda. Everybody wants it.
They've just instituted a professional doctorate, and as someone who had the pleasure of reviewing their curriculum this summer for the certificates, it is hands down substantively the best international relations program I've seen. So if anybody under the age of being eligible for Social Security has an interest in this program, I urge you to inquire, because this is really top of the line, innovative, substantively solid. I'm going to let Matt take 3 more questions. Then there is a reception and some food, although it's University of Colorado style. It's not lavish, but it's something that may get you across campus. 3 more questions, and we'll wrap it up for the reception.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, what do you see as the biggest threat to the U.S. in security matters, whether that's foreign or domestic? Do you think it's North Korea? And do you totally understand the motive of North Korea? If it is North Korea.
I would say North Korea in the short term.
Yeah.
I think over the long term, it's, midterm is going to be around. Long term, we will need to organize China. And get me wrong, I'm not buying into Graham Ellis' idea that we're going to go to war with China. What I do argue, though, is that we have to be careful with historical analogies. And I think you'd argue that, or I would argue, that the relationship between the United States and China today is very similar to the relationship between Britain and Imperial Germany in the latter part of the 19th century. You had a rising power of Germany. Germany just unified. It dominated them, it was militarily dominant on the continent. And the British were perfectly happy with that because it pitted them against their enemy, of course, France. And their expectation was that that would be fine. That would be work to their advantage. But then the Germans decided they'd build a fleet, which changed things completely. It was a threat to the British that the Germans didn't want to be accommodated in that situation. I think there's a lot of that going on right now. As far as North Korea, if you go back all the way back to Grandpa, the approach of the North Koreans was to rattle their swords, act irrational, and then we would give them what they wanted. And we know that. I mean, Bill Clinton gave them a reactor and a bunch of money, or 2 reactors and a bunch of money. Okay, how did that work out? I said, well, what you have, which is terrifying everybody, is the president is not going to do that. Now, what does that mean? What you have to understand is the event of a war on the Korean Peninsula would be devastating, especially to the South Koreans. Seoul is only 30 miles south of the demilitarized. But we think of Kim Jong-un as being irrational, but he's not. He understands in the event of war, he and his regime disappear from the face of the earth. They would be annihilated. And that is the real desire that they have is to stay in power, and I think that is a deterrent. Now, maybe I'm wrong. But actually, I think in some respects we're safer when we make it clear that when we actually draw a line where we're actually going to enforce it than we do when, say, if Putin decides he's going to bite off the western part of Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine, and we don't do anything about it, then he said, well, why not the Baltic states? Well, there's a big difference between Ukraine and the Baltics. The Baltics are members of NATO. So the real possibility of inadvertent war. So I think that in many respects, when you draw the line and make it clear that you're going to respond forcefully, I think that does have a deterrent effect. So again, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I think that deterrence, I think, in the case of North Korea. As I say, it's not inevitable we're going to go to war, but it's very clear that the Chinese are making themselves the dominant force in the Western Pacific, doing everything they can to basically expel us. The building of the islands, the nine dash line, you know, the island chains and so forth. You know, they're working very assiduously to establish it. Sure.
Following up a bit on some of the questions of other people here, how do you think civilian-military relations will change when the administrations are more the age of politicians like Marco Rubio or Jared Polis? I mean, like where they're currently in their 40s, were born late 60s, early 70s.
I don't necessarily think that's going to be, no, I think there's certain principles that we've accepted that if we abide, it doesn't matter the age of the individuals. I mean, look, you know, I'm a Vietnam guy, okay? I look at the world a little differently. I have certain understanding of things. I know that people 40 years younger than I don't necessarily see things the same way, but there's a certain basis of international affairs, military affairs, and so forth that will basically influence people no matter their age. And I think that I think that the fundamentals will remain the same regardless of the age of the politician or the soldiers for that matter.
Last question.
Sure.
In the 80s, the Iran conflict there. You talked about coalitions between, you know, different factions in military and different factions in civilian. In the 80s, civilian control was subverted. And that's, you know, arguably one of the most unhealthy things for civilian or civil military relations can happen. If you were able to, how would you address that kind of thing?
First of all, I would have done what P.X. Kelly did not do, and that is when Ollie North's time on the NSC staff was pulling back the Marine Corps. He always said that, Kelly always said that the biggest mistake he ever made was applying John Poindexter to talking him into keeping Ollie North for another year. That would not have happened. Look, I mean, there's no question that was an end run. It did subvert civil military relations. The National Security Council staff is not an operational staff. It's a planning staff. It's a coordination staff. But they got into business, I think, with this, you know, trying to take shortcuts and so forth. And so, yeah, you're right. That's also something you have to realize is when people talk about you know, the national security staff and all the stuff today, you know, people fighting with you know, Obama holdovers and so forth. Well, look, you know, 90% of the people who work on the staff are basically people who are deputed from other agencies, and they're going to go back to their agency at some point. Picture that was the situation. So, as long as you have control at the top, it is not part of the problem as Poindexter was, then you can avoid those situations.
Please give back a warm